Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry and I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. And I hope you're having a great day. All right, we're returning to Legal Eagle, and this video seems super interesting and very necessary. The Constitution doesn't say that. Have you ever heard somebody refer to the Constitution by saying something that you're not really sure if it's even in there? In fact, it happens a lot. So I'm excited to see what Legal Eagle has to show here and for me to be able to comment on it. Just a reminder that Historical March Madness is going on right now. A link to the voting is down below. Get your votes in now. All right, let's get started. All right, let's see what Jim Halpert has to say about the Constitution. Hope you're not misquoting it.
Yeah, I hate to tell you, but you're wrong about the Constitution. It's not your fault. I mean, that thing is like 7 pages long. Who has time to read that? And there's like 24 amendments. Pfft.
It's actually amazing how short the Constitution actually is, but nobody has read it.
But it's not your fault. Everyone is wrong about the Constitution. Think about this phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Communism!
In 1987, the Hearst Corporation conducted a survey to mark the bicentennial of the US Constitution. Over 50% of survey participants thought that that phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, was part of the US Constitution. And this wasn't a one-off result. According to a 2002 Columbia Law School study, nearly 2/3 of persons polled thought that this phrase came from the Constitution or from one of the founding fathers. But this phrase does not
overestimated
appear in the
people.
Constitution. James Madison, the author of the Constitution, didn't say it either. So, who did? Well, this was written by none other than Karl Marx in 1875 and then parodied by George Orwell in Animal Farm.
You are literally a commie if you have ever said that. And especially if you said that the Constitution said that. Oh, some Animal Farm, huh?
Marx wasn't the first person to
All
articulate
animals
this
are equal, but some are more equal than others. You ever heard that? Great quote.
ideas. Scholars trace the concept to the New Testament, which states in part, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. Now, the Soviet Union eventually incorporated the slogan into its constitution as, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his work, but that has never appeared in the US Constitution. So
I had never, is that a thing you'd actually heard before? I've never heard anyone say that that quote came from the US Constitution. It actually seems like something that people would love to quote the Constitution would not say. It seems like it's the opposite. But I don't know. I could be wrong. Maybe I just haven't talked to the right people.
So you can imagine if Americans confuse the US Constitution with the Soviet Constitution, they're probably wrong about a whole bunch of other things.
True.
Let's talk about it. One thing that people get wrong all the time is thinking that the Constitution mandates that English is the official language of the United States. That same 1987 Hearst survey found that 64% of the people believed that the Constitution made English the official national language of America. But English as the official language has never been part of the Constitution. Although English was the dominant language at the time the Constitution was ratified, many other languages flourished as well. The most common languages included Dutch, French, German, and the many languages.
Presidents that were native, like were Dutch speakers, you know what I mean? And then French and German is just going to continue on with the more of the immigration that's going to happen. Germans flocking in. Okay, that's going to be huge, flocking in, especially to the central part of the United States after Louisiana Purchase and settling in tons and tons of farmland. Plus France was the first to colonize in North America anyways. So that predates English.
By Native Americans. Enslaved people spoke African languages as well as made their own English-based Creole languages. And most of the founding fathers favored bilingual education. Thomas Jefferson spoke English, French, Italian, Latin, and he could also read Greek and Spanish. He hoped that America would establish colleges that would teach in French, Spanish, German, and other languages. Others, like Ben Franklin...
And now that's seen as like negative, that it's anti-American to try to promote bilingualism.
Saw it differently and said things that were incredibly offensive and Malthusian, saying, quote, those Germans who come hither are generally the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. They will soon outnumber us, that all the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and
our favorite
our
president
will become
Benjamin Franklin.
Luckily, he didn't win the day on that one. Now, states with large German populations disagreed with.
Don't worry. There are other presidents that have said stuff at least as equally as bad than that.
Ben Franklin, at least initially. In the 1800s, Pennsylvania and Ohio passed laws allowing German to be taught in public schools. Of course, however, Americans have consistently attempted to limit the speaking of other languages in this country. Politicians have tried to introduce a constitutional amendment making English the official language, which would force the government to stop providing bilingual services. So far, these efforts have failed. And
so, I mean, would you say that's just an attempt to try to force assimilation with that, to just not even publish stuff in other languages that, you know, other countries can read and stuff like that? And not just immigrants, but just other countries, people of other countries can be able to read, you know?
Constitutional amendment hasn't passed. Congress historically has passed all kinds of laws that would prevent people from speaking non-English languages. For example, in the 19th century, the government forced Native American children to attend missionary schools. In 1887, the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided that mission schools on reservations were required to provide all instruction in English.
By the way, very common in Canada as well. You saw those just sucking the culture out of a lot of these indigenous groups, right? It's like abandon so many cultural things, adopt this, you know, religion and these languages, kind of, again, forced assimilation. Couldn't see it as both coexisting, you know?
Children who used their own languages were bullied and beaten by the instructors. This, of course, led to immense language loss. And, of course, French was the dominant language in the Louisiana Territory for over 100 years. The first Louisiana constitutions made English and French the official dual languages of the state. But Louisiana was a melting pot for different ethnic groups, and eventually their dialects merged to produce what we call Louisiana French.
Sure. Yeah, your Cajun stuff there. Yeah, Mississippi, the lifeblood of the heart of America, was colonized by the French, right? It's the United States bought that from France, and then from Napoleon, actually. And originally, if you didn't know, the Americans were just interested in, at first, just New Orleans. They thought maybe that's all they could really afford. New Orleans, which is the port that ends the Mississippi River, right? Napoleon, needing quick return on investment, needed money for the Napoleonic War, said, hey, just take our whole landmass that we have in North America there, which doubled the size of the United States. But yeah, that's where that French influence comes from. And then St. Lawrence River, which is kind of the dividing point between today U.S. and Canada. Remember, that was first explored by the French. So those are the earliest parts of colonization in North America and what would be the United States.
But in 1921, Louisiana adopted a new state constitution which reversed the policy of bilingual rights. The state banned the teaching of French in all public schools, which highlights one of the differences
a long time
between
after the
US
Americans
federal constitution and individual state constitutions.
100 years.
But of course, these trends continue to this day. Representative Louis Gohmert introduced the English Language Unity Act of 2021, which would declare English as the, quote, official language of the United States to establish a uniform English language rule for naturalization and to avoid misconstructions of the English language texts of the laws of the United States pursuant to Congress's power to provide for the general welfare of the United States and to establish uniform rule of naturalization under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
So the argument he's making there is that translating stuff into multiple languages will lead to mistranslations of laws. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that is really the thought behind, you know, creating an official one language state? Would that also mean then that, like, you wouldn't have bilingual education in schools? The other thoughts behind that? What do you think?
Of course, the reason that Gohmert wanted to pass this law is because it's not in the Constitution at all.
Right.
And Gohmert's bill was referred to committee where it died. But putting language aside, surely that old chestnut, no taxation without representation, found its way into the Constitution, right?
No.
Well, the popular history of the American Revolution goes...
Not at all. No taxation. Why would that be in the Constitution? Because that was the justification for the American Revolution, right? Constitution, the United States has already been independent. It's actually been independent for a few years because we went without a constitution for years. We just operated under the Articles of Confederation, which were very loose, right? Because the idea was have a lot more state power, and then with interstate commerce and all those other issues, creating a national government. So No taxation without representation. That's just a motto for the revolution. You're not even going to get that in like the Declaration of Independence.
Like this. The colonists got so fed up with King George III's high taxes that they chucked British tea into the Boston Harbor, decided Americans would henceforth become coffee drinkers, and wrote a constitution ensuring that no one would ever be taxed again without being adequately represented. Well, as a resident of the District of Columbia, I would have to take issue with this particular summary of American history. In the 1700s, the colonists objected to the Stamp Act and other similar laws that imposed taxes on them because they couldn't vote and didn't have representation in Parliament.
By the way, those new taxes were because of the result of the 7 Years' War. Which ended in the 1750s, which assured British dominance in the Western Hemisphere as well as around the world. French and Indian War is what that was called. But the immense amount of economic loss from that was attempted to be recouped by taxing the American colonies. So you had new taxes show up. There was a bunch of them, right? But I heard about them in your classes. But yeah, and with those imposed, you know, Americans didn't want to pay the taxes. But a much better response and justification they felt was not just to say that like, hey, we shouldn't be taxed at all. In fact, American colonists were taxed at a lower percentage than like British citizens, because that would sound very whiny, you know, but make it talked about political representation, because in Parliament, there's not representation from their colonies. So they're like, well, since we don't have any representation in the government in England, shouldn't have to be a part of those taxes because we weren't a part of the those that decided on it. But even if, the thing is that even if the Americans had representation, it would not have prevented new taxes. There's no way. They would have been outvoted, you know, crazy. So, but it sounds a lot better than just being whiny. You actually try to put it on the British that they are the ones being unfair.
And in response, the English came up with a theory of virtual representation, which meant that since Parliament existed, every British subject was represented, regardless of whether they could vote. Of course, the young American colonists didn't exactly take to
What's representation if you can't vote,
meetings. After all the pontificating about taxes and voting and the subsequent War of Independence, perhaps the biggest surprise of all is that the taxation without representation didn't make it into the final cut of the Constitution. Though the colonists did try hard to work it into the founding documents. The Articles of Confederation incorporated a we hate taxes stance by denying the federal government the right to levy taxes at all.
States could, though.
This sounded cool on paper,
but States could, though. And then there was no income tax either, even with the beginning of the Constitution.
A really big mess in reality because the new government couldn't pay its war debts. It also couldn't raise enough money for an army or navy.
Or any infrastructure.
The British occupied forts in the Great Lakes while also dumping its convicts into the colonies. And so for this and many other reasons, the Americans had to write a new governing document that eventually became the Constitution. And you had better well believe that it gave the federal government the right to levy taxes. The problem is they forgot to mention that in order to levy taxes, everyone needed to be adequately represented. The state and local authorities also got the power to levy taxes, but the end result is that the Constitution doesn't guarantee no taxation without representation. Yeah. But the motto is still a rallying cry for the disenfranchised
But it's population. Still in the Constitution about who can like create them, you know. But it has nothing to do with representation.
Especially in the nation's capital where I live, Washington, D.C., which is also the only geographical entity in the contiguous United States whose citizens must pay taxes and register for selective service without having political representation in Congress. Well, at least political representation.
D.C. politics are weird.
Do something. DC residents pay more taxes than residents in 22 states and pay more money per capita to the federal government than any actual state. Now, we are not the only ones. Who else pays taxes without representation? Well, undocumented immigrants pay about $7 billion a year in taxes. Inmates pay taxes, and so do formerly incarcerated people, even if their voting rights have
territories
not
like Puerto
restored.
Rico as
American
well.
Children work and pay
the other territories that are citizens but don't vote, like Puerto Ricans.
Tax and income tax, but they lack the representation of a vote. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole bunch of taxation without representation in the United States. And that's probably because the Constitution doesn't guarantee that right. Americans hate taxes, but they love shopping. And a lot of people think that they have a right to enter a particular store, or at least they have a right to contract with other people, the freedom to contract. This guy believes he has a constitutional right to eat at the Trump Grill in New York City.
Dates are not
but here
law.
The police officer contends that a reservation is not a constitutional right.
It's not a guarantee. I can't revoke my reservation. It's not a guarantee. It's not a constitutional right.
The protester is in fact wrong about his constitutional right to keep his dinner reservation, but this is an interesting question. Do people have
It's in the right to enter a store or a restaurant. It's in there. I have the right to, I have the constitutional right to Applebee's jalapeno poppers, okay?
Have a constitutional right to enter a store or a restaurant. The Constitution is often silent about most things, so it shouldn't be surprising that no one has an explicit reference to where people are allowed to be. But the 1980 U.S. Supreme Court case Pruneyard Shopping Center versus Robbins said that the Constitution does not give people an absolute right to enter and remain on private property, even if they intend to exercise their First Amendment right to free expression. So if this man wants to get into a restaurant to protest, he doesn't actually have a constitutional right to do so, despite the First Amendment. But what about if the city or state government has imposed a vaccination requirement to enter? Does that violate the Constitution? Well, so far the answer is no, because not all unequal treatment violates federal or state laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 explicitly
Man, that became such a debated topic during COVID mandates and stuff like that, of people trying to justify things one way or the other, right? And with like precedent of law. And yeah, a lot of people were wrong on all sides of the issue and of the argument.
Draws from refusing service to customers based on race,
LBJ.
color, religion, or national origin. A restaurant can't refuse service to black people or white people or Muslims or atheists, for example, but when it comes to other classes of people, it's a complete toss-up. They can do what they want. Restaurants and business owners have argued that they have a religious right to refuse service to gay and transgender people because of the owner's religious beliefs. Now, the Supreme Court has yet to definitively settle that issue, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Supreme Court over the next few years.
That's interesting. That's been such an interesting thing, is like where do religions cross with law and things like that? You can say your religion lets you ban insert group of people here, but then you also have laws that say you can't ban people on insert issue here, right? And yeah, that keeps getting talked about.
Particular issue. It's definitely going to
come up. It's been tough.
But
right of religion versus civil rights. It's like, what happens when those things contradict each other? You come at a standstill, and then it just gets tied up in court. And
local regulation prevents unvaccinated people from entering a restaurant, which is what happened with the situation in New York City. We're not talking about a protected or quasi-protected class of people based on their race, ethnicity, or gender. That means a lower standard of review. In other words, rational basis review, which basically no law ever fails. So the bottom line is that the Constitution is not going to protect your dinner reservation if there is a specific enforceable law that says you can't go inside. Then there's a phrase that
Man, how bad did it suck if you were somebody, police, restaurant worker, retail worker, all the people that had to, it was part of their job and their requirement, you know, to turn people away or require certain documentation. You know, all those people that had to go through with that. I always felt bad for those people, you know, whether they believe it or not, but it was, you know, something forced for their job, you know, have to do with that much confrontation. That sucked.
I think everyone is familiar with the idea that the criminal law presumes that you are innocent until proven guilty. Now, that idea that you are presumed innocent until proven guilty is one of the most significant principles in American law. The rights of criminal defendants are very much part of the Constitution. For example, the Fifth Amendment bars self-incrimination. Quote, no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. This is known as the right to remain silent. The Sixth Amendment requires that people be given a speedy and impartial jury trial, an attorney in criminal prosecutions, and establishes defendants' right to confront adverse witnesses. And the 14th Amendment provides for due process of law. However, the Constitution does not require that a state prove that someone committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And the Constitution doesn't say that you're innocent until proven guilty.
That's so interesting. Now I think we're getting to the first one of all the things that he's talked about thus far that it's like are very much policies and yeah, how court rules and court expectations and all that stuff, but not in the Constitution, because that's still that idea of like burden of proof on those that are accusing, right? It's on the prosecutor to prove guilt more than it is the defense to have to prove innocence, right? I mean, those are cherished things. Goes back to like the Roman Empire. That was a big thing in the Roman judicial system that a lot of people have cited for modern day systems, which is that whole idea, right, of innocent till proven guilty, be able to basically respond to your accuser, to know who your accuser is, to be able to apply a defense. So that's interesting. I actually didn't know that specific wording wasn't necessarily in the Constitution, even though it is standard practice. So finally got one here. I feel like that a lot of us Maybe didn't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, though. Let me know.
Now, I'm not saying that the concept of innocent until proven guilty is not important, but the bigger point is that not all fundamental rights can be sourced directly to a line of text in the Constitution. Astute legal eagles.
And remember, there's literally amendment, the Ninth Amendment, says that there are rights that are not in the Constitution. The Constitution is not the be all end all of rights, which then leads to this, the 10th Amendment, which basically says that states can decide on the other things, right? States can decide on the other things. So there is that open door still, right? That is left open with the Ninth Amendment and into the 10th Amendment.
We know that many of our important legal principles come from English common law, but the presumption of innocence has a more complicated origin story. It isn't found in any of the sources we traditionally cite for English common law, like the Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights of 1689, or treatises by Coke and Blackstone. In fact, this presumption comes from Roman law and canon law, which form the common law of Europe. And eventually this principle made its way into common law in a very roundabout way. In Coffin versus the United States, the Supreme Court held that the presumption of innocence was a bedrock concept in the American criminal justice system.
So it was actually challenged.
Then Justice White credited this to an Irish jurist named Leonard McNally. McNally was
You
known
would have so many more people incarcerated if innocence had to be proven, right? Rather than guilt be proven. You'd have a lot more people as well. And this is actually a debate kind of thing, a conversation I like having with my classes is, what is more important? I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but like what's a bigger deal, that an innocent person is, jailed or a guilty person walks free? And it's a lot of perspective, because if it's you personally, that happens to you, obviously you're going to be on one side or the other. But generally people, in my dealings and talking with people say it's worth risking the idea of guilty people going free, that it's far more egregious that an innocent person be found guilty when the evidence is wrong or is insufficient. What do you think about that too?
Zealous advocate for Irish defendants who were accused of treason. And McNally was known as a zealous advocate for Irish defendants who were accused of treason. And during McNally's lifetime, the British system required 2 witnesses to prove someone guilty of treason, unless the accused was Irish, in which case 1 witness was sufficient.
Oh, jeez.
After McNally's death, the English press found out that despite his years of advocacy for the presumption of Irish innocence, McNally was in fact a double agent. He represented Irish revolutionaries in court, but reported on their activities to prosecutors for at least 26 years. Despite McNally's dubious role as a double agent for the government, today the principle of innocent until proven guilty is fundamental to the criminal justice system in the United States, despite it having no reference whatsoever in the Constitution itself. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that you're wrong about the Constitution, but this video isn't over because there's another Legal Eagle video about even more things that you're wrong regarding the Constitution. Not you, obviously, but your friends, probably. Things like the filibuster and the separation of church and state. And this full-length companion...
Is that not the biggest one that everybody thinks they know about, is like church and state, of separation? Because, there's not much talked about with that at all. But doesn't mean it's not like precedent, you know what I mean?
Video exists exclusively on Nebula because sadly, if I put it on YouTube, it'd probably get demonetized and there's no way that you'd ever see it.
Boy, is that what's happening right now. Holy crap. There's a new wave of demonetization videos going around in, I can't speak for all the political circles on YouTube and political communities, but history, man, it's bad right now. It's really bad stuff. I don't know what happened, but something has happened. It was like getting bad, like 3 years ago, and then it got better, and now it's gone bad again. And whatever is picking up, because all this stuff is detected by software, that it picks up certain key things, and for history, anytime you bring up Mustache Man or Mustache Man's party or there's a lot of different topics, it's just insta flagged, right? And you have to go through a manual review process. It used to be too, in my case, since I cover so many different things, that the manual review more likely than not approved of monetization of your video, so it just made it a little bit more of a hassle when like a human actually looked at it. But I'm finding right now that those reviews are being shot down. Like I've had to, request reviews from a lot of the topics I've covered, and they're actually coming back where the manual reviewer is in fact supporting the original, software detection or whatever, and upholding that it's not deemed for all advertisers. which made me wonder how close are people actually reviewing it. I don't know. By the way, I just wanted to use that as a way to hopefully encourage all of you to make sure you're supporting your favorite content creators, you know, because they are suffering right now. So things like channel memberships with YouTube, Patreon, buying merch and stuff like that. As much as you can for all your favorite contributors, you know, do that for sure. Okay.
But Nebula is...
All right, final thoughts. All right, then. So I want to know how many of the things that you saw him brought up were things that you believed in, or maybe at some time you did believe they were in the Constitution. Also, what are the ones maybe that you've seen here that you've heard people say, you know, are in the Constitution, right? Which ones are you hearing people say? What are some other ones that were not talked about in this video that you consistently just hear people say the Constitution backs it up? So let's debunk all that stuff. Now, again, one of the things that we came away with this too, though, is just because it's not in the Constitution doesn't mean it has precedent or validity to it. But you could at least fix the idea that no, it's not in the Constitution. All right. Thanks to everybody for watching. Again, go down below to participate in March Madness. I'll put the link to the current round of voting right now. Have fun with that, and we'll see y'all next time.